and welcome back to yet another video. This week I am remaking a costume that I made, oh gosh, I think 10 years ago, and that is Mary Poppins Jolly Holiday costume. So without any further ado, let me show you exactly how I made it. For the pattern, I'm using this one from New Zealand Corsetry. And for fabrics, I had you guys vote on Instagram for what you wanted to see as the lining fabric, and of course the penguins won by a huge margin. For the outer fabric, I'm using this red satin that's left over from my Padme project. And finally, I'm using a red cotton drill for the interlining layers. Now, onto the corset. So first I made a mock-up out of calico, and it fit me like a glove. So then I drew in all of the changes that I wanted to make, and you can see those in the coloured ink there. And then I made those changes and was ready to cut it out of the real fabrics. Once all of the layers were cut out, it was time to add the interlining layers to each fabric. So that's just a layer of drill, and it gets basted to the fabric around the outside. Once every piece of the corset had been basted, and there were a lot of pieces, it was time to transfer the boning channel markings. Now to do this, I'm using some tracing paper and a tracing wheel, and just marking those straight into the lining layers of the fabric. And once every piece had their markings, it was now time to sew in those said boning channels. So I'm just using a cotton twill tape, and placing that over exactly where I've traced the markings for the channels to go. Then I sew down either end of the twill tape as close to the edge as I can possibly get, and that creates the boning channel. Once all the boning channels were sewn in place, I then got to sew the special one, which is the centre front one. So first I sewed the two centre front pieces together, then I ironed the seam open and flat, and then I put in another piece of twill tape just straight over that edge and sewed that down in place. Then it was time to sew every other piece of the corset together. Okay, so the lining is all done, the structural layer put together, great. So now I've got to do the red satin overlayer and put that together. Originally I wanted to make my own piping for this so that it would match the underlayer of the top. But I'm on a time crunch now and I don't have the time to cut out all of the bias strips and then sew it into piping. So instead I got some ready to go piping and I'm going to use that instead. It's just a white satin. I'll show you with the first piece how I put it in, and then the rest of the corset is going to be put together exactly like the base layer was, so won't show you that. Instead, I'll just come back when the top layer's done. So there's only a few seams in the front and the back of the corset that actually have the piping detail. So as you can see here, I'm just adding the piping in between the seams and then sewing it in place. To make sure I get the piping in there nice and snug, I'm actually basting it to one side of the pattern first, and I'm doing that using a zipper foot so that it gets nice and close to that edge. And once again, using the zipper foot, I then sew the other piece on top, making sure to go over that line I sewed when I basted. And now it's time for the boning, so I'm using flat steel in the very centre front and end pieces, and then spiral steel for every other bone. After putting every single bone in the channels, I can now sew the outside of the corset to the lining. So I do that with the right sides together and sew just the end pieces together first. So it is a new day and it's time for me to acknowledge a new mistake. Yay. Last night when I was editing the footage of making this yesterday, I was comparing it to the original Mary Poppins costume, and I noticed the corset's the wrong shape. So I've gotten this far into making it, all I had to do was attach the lining layer at the top and bottom there, and it was finished. My one comes down too low in the sides here. Her one actually shapes up in more of a scoop there, so Thankfully, it's not to a point where it's going to be a major job to change this. All I'm going to do is just cut that shape there out, and then it should be fixed. So, see you guys shortly after I've done that. After cutting the corset to the right shape this time, I machine sewed the lining along the bottom edge, and then along the top edge I sewed it to the lining by hand. Finally, using my hole punch, I made room for eyelets in the back. And after all the eyelets were hammered in place, it was time to make the petticoat. For the pattern, I'm using Simplicity 3737 View C. Fabric-wise, I have just shy of 20 metres of this red bridal tulle, a couple of metres of this pinky red cotton, and one of the fabrics you guys didn't choose for the lining of the corset to create the yoke from. And finally, 40 metres of the scallop lace which I'll hem the petticoat with. I don't think I've ever come across a pattern piece that requires this many pieces to be cut of a single piece. Well, let's get started, I guess. First, I cut out the 2 pieces that will become the yoke of the petticoat. Then I cut out the lining pieces. Then I begin the tediously long process of cutting out all 28 pieces that will become the petticoat. I'm doing each of the pieces singularly because the tulle shifts a lot when I'm cutting it and I don't want to make any mistakes here. It's now just after 1:30 and I have finally cut out all 28 pieces of the petticoat. I stopped and had lunch for about like an hour halfway through that. So yeah, I've been doing this since this morning and only just finished cutting out the pattern pieces now. So on to assembly. The first thing I do is sew the yoke pieces together at the side seams. Okay, this next step in the process is just going to be easier for me if I show you guys the written instructions and then show you a time lapse of me then creating the said piece, because remember how there's like 28 individual pieces here? Yeah, that's going to get real fiddly really fast, but if you read it and then hopefully with the time lapse you can sort of see how it goes together. So what you see me doing here is creating all 4 of the tiers, or should I say 4 very long donut pieces. I'm sewing the seams straight with my overlocker just to reduce the bulk of the seams and to give it a nice finish. After all the tulle layers are assembled, I then move back onto the lining and create the donut out of those 3 pieces. Okay, all of the tiers have now been cut out, so now I've got to gather the top edges of all of them and then sew them together as the instructions called for. So what I might do is gather the top edge like I just said, sew it together, and then show you guys each tier as it's added to the petticoat, because once again there's so much going on here that I think it might just get a little bit confusing otherwise. So let's go. I decided to machine gather the edges just to save me some time, and I do that with a gathering foot, loose tension and a long straight stitch. Here is the lining layer added to the yoke before I realised that the first layer of tulle also needed to go on that layer. Here is a double layer of tulle added to the lining layer. And finally, a single layer of tulle added to the tulle layer. Welcome to more petticoat fun time. It now has all of the layers on it, which is great. However, as it stands right now, fractionally too long. At the moment, the bottom of this is cutting like bottom of the ankle, and I think, judging from reference photos, I want it to sit like top of the ankle, bottom of the calf, mid-calf maybe. What I'm going to do, because there's so many layers in the bottom here, is I am not going to hem this from the bottom because that would just take me way too long. Instead, I'm going to hem it from the top. So I'm just going to cut that down until it's sitting at a height around my ankles that I'm happy with, and then add the waistband in that way. After that's done, I then get to add all of the lace to the bottom tiers. Actually, now that I've said that, I think I'm going to add the lace to the bottom tiers now so that I know how long they're going to be sitting. And apparently there is at least 40 meters of fabric in this hem, so yay, let's get started on that. As I just mentioned, and as you can see here in this footage, the bottom of the petticoat is hemmed with a beautiful scalloped white lace, so that's what I'm going to be doing here. So sit back and please enjoy this time lapse of me adding the lace to the hem of the petticoat. With all the lace sewn onto the bottom, it is now time to create the waistband. So I'm just folding over the waistband here by 4 centimeters. And then sewing it down close to the edge to create a channel for the elastic to go through. For the elastic, I just cut a length that was comfortable to fit around my waist. I then thread it through the channel using a safety pin. And then using a zigzag stitch, I attach the two ends of the elastic together. And with all that done, of course I couldn't resist trying it on for the first time. Now onto the dress. So this is sort of two dresses in one here. You have an underlayer of a solid white colour and then an overlayer that is made out of a transparent silk. So I'm going to split this making up into two here, and first I'm going to do the underlayer and then I'll be doing the silk overlayer. For the underlayer, I'm using one of my favourite dress patterns ever, Butterick B5748. And for the silk layer, I found this Vintage Simplicity bridal pattern, number 5943. And for the fabric, I'm using cotton sateen for the underlayer, lined with this pony drill. For the overlayer, I'm using a white silk organza. And for details, I'm using a series of white laces. I'll be using this embroidered tulle to add embroidery pieces to the silk organza, and finally this red velvet ribbon for all of the bows and red ribbon details. So first things first, I begin working on the underdress, cutting out all of the pattern pieces from the cotton sateen, and then the bodice lining from the horse fabric. Next I sew in all of the darts in the front and back of the bodice pieces. And just remember, everything you see me doing to the outer pieces, I'm also doing to the lining pieces at the same time. With all the darts sewn in place, I can now sew the front and back pieces together at the shoulder seams. And before sewing the side seams together, I'm adding this lace detail along the neckline of the bodice. Once the lace is sewn in place, I can now sew the outer fabric to the lining fabric along that same neckline. I then understitch the neckline so that none of the pony fabric will be seen. Finally, I trim away the excess fabric so that it'll sit nice when it's rolled out the right way. Now it's onto the skirt, so I'm just creating a circle skirt here, just using my measurements that I was happy with. And once the pieces were cut out, I sewed them together at the sides. And here's how it's all looking so far. Top is sewn together apart from armholes and the side, and it's at this point that I realised I had altered the pattern piece since last time I'd sewn this for my Card Captor Sakura costume, and what I'd done is actually lowered the bust scoop here, and I don't know if this is going to work for this particular costume, but I've already sewn it and done a really nice job with it too, so it'd be a lot of work now to unpick the two front panels just to make them again. And so I'm going to sew the armholes and the side pieces up next, try it on, see how it looks, and if it's really bad then I'll consider doing it. But as for now, I'm hoping that the gathering of the top layer and then the bib piece that goes on will cover this area so you don't see it. Remember to check your pattern pieces are whole pieces before you go ahead and make something else out of them. Before trying it on, I wanted to get the most accurate representation of the fit, and to do that I did have to sew up the armholes and the side seams. Alright, so here it is tried on. Obviously no fastening in the back just yet because I can't do that till I do the top layer, but I'm happy with this. It's not as bad as it looked on the mannequin. Let's do the rest of it. Now, because silk is a notoriously difficult fabric to work with, silk organza that is, I'm going to reintroduce you to the trick that I learnt at the end of making my Alice in Wonderland costume, and that is hairspray. So give it a light once over with this, let it dry. It stiffens the fabric and makes it so much easier to work with, so let's get going.
I think I should be a professor.
After waiting for the hairspray to dry, I just created another circle skirt exactly as I'd done with the cotton sateen layer. Now, a cool thing about using the full width of the silk organza is I actually get to use the selvage ends to sew in the side seams, which means I didn't actually have to finish them. However, I did anyway, and I used French seams. With both the sides sewn together, it was now time to add the placement of the red ribbons, which first I had to make. So to do that, I'm using some red velvet cut to these lengths here, and finishing the ends in the flame to melt them, then folding them into this bow shape here and running that through a zigzag stitch on my machine. Then using some fabric glue, I glue the smaller strip over the stitching lines that we've just made, hiding it all. And voila, that's all the bows made, so I made 12 in total for the skirt and 1 for the collar. To add them to the skirt, I just sewed them in place by hand. And here's how they all looked once they were sewn to the skirt. Now, onto that embroidery. Using that embroidered lace I showed you earlier and a hot knife, I was able to cut out all of the floral pieces to use as appliques to add to the silk. I evenly spaced them in between all of the ribbings along the top of the skirt and along the bottom. Then I sewed them all in place using my machine. And of course it was at this point I realised I'd sewn the ribbons too low and they needed to be moved up the skirt. But to figure out how far, I first decided I needed to hem the skirt. So that's what you see me doing here. I'm measuring the bottom edge of the skirt evenly and then cutting out the excess fabric. To hem the skirt, I actually decided to go with a rolled hem using my overlocker to create it. It was nice, quick, simple and easy, and that's what I loved about it at this point. With the skirt done, it was now time to move on to the top. So here you see me using that vintage simplicity pattern and cutting out the pieces and applying some more appliques to the back. With all the appliques in place, it was now time to sew the front and back pieces together. And for every seam on the top, I will be doing it using a French seam. With the top sewn together, I then moved on to the sleeves, and first I added this ruffled lace and this eyelet lace to the bottom edge of the cuff. I then threaded some of the red velvet in between the eyelet lace. Then after doing that tiny pleat at the elbow there, it was time to sew the sleeves together down the side seam. And then I sewed the sleeve into the top. With the sleeves in, it was now time to do the back closure. So I folded the back edge over, encasing the white cotton sateen layer, and then just sewed it down the edge there. Then I had to add the ginormous buttons that she has, and luckily I found the self-covering button kit at the op shop. Using scraps of the cotton sateen and the silk, I just put it into the buttonhole making kit and voila! Ended up making myself some nice self-covered buttons. The buttons were sewn by hand to the back of the dress, and silly me forgot to show you the buttonholes, but they were just made using my machine. Next, the collar. This consisted of 2 layers of silk organza sewn along the top and side edges here. Then it was sewn to the bodice. And for the final touch, some decorative lace. Next, the bib, which I sort of just winged. I created this rectangle shape from 2 layers of the organza, making sure to round off just the bottom edge. I then cut the 2 layers out and sewed them together. I left a little opening at the top so I could turn it right side out and then add the laces. I have a pink one and a white one. And this part was really simple. I just added the lace along the edge of the bib thingy and sewed it in place. Then I repeated it again with another layer of the white lace. And finally a layer of the pink lace in the centre. Then I ran some gathering stitches down the centre of the silk organza and gathered that till it was a length I was happy with. To secure the gathering, I did some zigzag stitches straight over the top of it. And finally, I added a bajillion non-functional buttons down the centre. These are the base boots that I brought off of AliExpress. And as you can see, the bits that are red are currently black, so let's fix that. Using a light grit sandpaper, I sand the black pieces to prepare them for paint. I need to make sure the red is going to show up, so I'm painting them first with a white base. I only did 1 layer of the white, but I really should have done 2, because it means I have to do more layers of the red later. Here's a little before and after of just 1 layer of white paint. Now onto the red. I ended up doing 4 layers of the red paint. here it is all done, and guess what? I've also taken off the buttons, which I am going to replace with these red ones. To do that, I used a curved needle and just sewed them directly into the shoe. And here's the finished shoe. Next, the umbrella. So I bought this kid-sized umbrella from Kmart. And it was the perfect size, just not the perfect length in the handle, but I'll get to that later. So the first thing I did was to release the unicorn umbrella covering fabric thing from the spokes. I don't know what any of the umbrella terminology is here, I'm sorry. And using my own fabric, I am attempting to reskin it. So I have this pink fabric here and this white fabric here. These are just plastics. And then I have this gathered ribbon trim to go along the edges. Using a pattern I made from the old umbrella skin, I began cutting out the fabric. Then I began sewing all of the triangles together. I also cut out any of the excess fabric in the seam as well, just to reduce the bulk. After I had both the top and bottom layers done, I sewed them together along the outside edge. Next, using some white bias tape, I then covered the raw edge of the outside of the umbrella. I then pinned the bias tape in place, encasing the raw edge, and then pinned this ruffle trim to the underside of it so that when I stitched it down, I would also be stitching down the trim. Then I matched up the umbrella corners with the spokes and sewed it back into place. So my dad has very kindly extended the umbrella for me, so now it's the right length, and he did it with an old tent pole by the looks of it. So now all I have to do is, using some Sculpey, I'm going to sculpt the bird head that goes on this end, and then I can paint it all white and add the finishing touches to it, and that'll be the umbrella done. For the bird head, I made a rough shape from tinfoil first, then added a very thin layer of Sculpey to that, and finished it off with some small details before baking it in the oven. And finally, the hat. I found this hat at the second-hand store and I intend on using it as the base. The first thing I have to do is to remove this bow on the back. After that's done, using some bias tape, I create a channel around the brim of the hat. I sew the bias tape down in place using my machine and leaving a small gap open in the back of the hat. I'm doing this so that I can add some extra strength and stability as well as some posability to the brim using this wire. After I finished putting the wire in the brim, I wanted to lower the height of the hat because it was sitting a little bit too high, so I just cut it directly off of the brim. I then cut an inch or so off the bottom of the crown, and then using a zigzag stitch on my machine, I sewed the crown back onto the brim. Now it's time to decorate, so I have some soft white tulle here, which I cut into some rectangular strips, and then place them onto the top of the hat like so, with a bow in the back, and to make sure she has the chin strap as well. And finally, I glued on some pink petals, and that's the hat done. And there you have it. That is how I made my Mary Poppins Jolly Holiday costume. Now I am so happy with how this version turned out, especially in comparison to the first one I made. I just think there's so many details on this one that look a lot better than my first, especially the bib. I like that I had the idea to put snaps into the bib piece so that it actually stays nice and straight on the costume because my old one sagged a bit. I love the fabric that this one is made from. It is so comfortable. Silk, organza, and cotton sateen happen to be some of my favourite fabrics to work with at the moment, and they're so comfortable to wear. The one bummer thing about this though is the first time I wore this, which was to Sandbox Fandom Festival, I must have cut the seams in the back of the corset a little bit too thin when I was taking the bulk out of them, and so I now have pulling in the back of the corset, and I'm not sure how I'm going to fix that, so that's really bummed me out, but thankfully it is in the back. The only thing I would do differently on this costume is I think I might have a go at making the hat from scratch. I don't think the hat that I brought from the secondhand store is wide enough, and I think it's a little bit too see-through. I think it needed to be a little bit more opaque, but other than that, super happy with this costume, and yeah, it's nice to have that one ticked off the list now. I do not feel an urge to recreate that one anymore. Let me know what you guys thought of it though, down below in the comment section. I love hearing your guys' thoughts and opinions on stuff. And if you like this video, maybe consider leaving a like, and if you really liked it, maybe consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting, and fun related things here on this channel, and I'm trying to upload at least once a month now. I promise. Alright, with all that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye!